Hey there, curious minds. Today we're stepping into territory that makes scientists squirm in their lab coats and historians nervously shuffle their papers. We're talking about ancient mysteries, the kind that shouldn't exist but stubbornly do. 1,000-ton stones that somehow got moved without trucks or cranes. Maps drawn centuries before the lands they show were discovered. Metal that refuses to rust after 1,600 years just to spite modern metallurgy. You know, casual stuff. Here's the uncomfortable truth. We like to believe that human progress moves in a neat little line. Cave paintings, then pyramids, then smartphones. Done. But scattered across our planet are artifacts, structures, and texts that basically look at that timeline and laugh. These aren't conspiracy theories cooked up in someone's basement. These are real objects sitting in real museums, real ruins you can visit, real questions that have been haunting researchers for generations. And the answers? Still pending. So buckle up, because we're about to tour the places where history gets weird and science throws up its hands. Before we dive in, smash that like button if you're into this kind of rabbit hole, and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from right now? I genuinely want to know who's joining me on this journey to the edge of what we think we know. Let's go. Now let's talk about rocks. Not just any rocks, mind you. We're talking about stones so absurdly massive that modern engineers look at them, scratch their heads, and quietly change the subject. Welcome to Baalbek, a place in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, where the laws of physics apparently went on permanent vacation sometime around 2,000 years ago. Or maybe much, much earlier. Nobody's entirely sure, and that's precisely the problem. Picture this. You're standing in what was once one of the Roman Empire's most spectacular temple complexes. Towering columns, intricate carvings, the whole imperial package. The Romans weren't exactly known for thinking small. These were the people who built aqueducts spanning hundreds of miles and threw gladiator fights as casual entertainment. But here's where things get weird. Underneath all that Roman architectural swagger sits a foundation made of stone blocks so enormous that the Romans themselves probably looked at them and thought, yeah, we definitely didn't do that. The platform these temples rest on includes stones weighing over 800 tons each. For context, that's roughly the weight of 2 fully loaded Boeing 747 aircraft stacked on top of each other. Made of solid limestone, and somehow placed with millimeter precision by people who, according to mainstream history, had access to nothing more sophisticated than wooden rollers, hemp ropes, and a really good attitude. But wait, it gets better. The Romans, in all their engineering glory, built their temple on top of this existing platform. They didn't create the foundation, they inherited it. And if the platform stones weren't mind-bending enough, the nearby quarry contains something even more outrageous. A stone block so large it was never actually moved. Meet the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, a charming name for a 1,200-ton monster that has been lying in the same spot for millennia, apparently waiting for someone to figure out how to pick it up. Spoiler alert, no one has. Not the Romans, not medieval engineers, not us. This single block weighs more than 3 statues of Liberty combined, and it was carved with such precision that you could run your hand along its surface and barely feel a seam. The quarry workers shaped it, smoothed it, prepared it for transport, and then just left. Either they ran out of funding, lost interest, or realized they had absolutely no idea how to move the thing in the first place. Given that we still can't figure it out today, option 3 seems increasingly plausible. And if you thought that was the end of the story, think again. In 2014, archaeologists discovered an even larger stone buried nearby. This one weighs approximately 1,650 tons. That's not a typo. 1,650 tons of solid rock, carefully shaped and prepared for use, sitting in the ground like the universe's most elaborate practical joke. Modern cranes, the biggest ones we have, the kind used to build skyscrapers and offshore oil platforms, max out at around 1,200 tons under ideal conditions. And those conditions involve flat ground, perfect weather, and about 17 safety meetings before anyone pushes a button. The ancient builders of Baalbek didn't have cranes. They didn't have hydraulics. They didn't have electricity, internal combustion engines, or apparently any respect for what should be physically possible. The official explanation, the one you'll find in most textbooks and on most guided tours, goes something like this. The Romans used a combination of wooden cranes, pulleys, ramps, and an enormous workforce to move these stones. Thousands of workers pulling on ropes, rolling logs underneath, pushing and heaving with superhuman determination. It's a nice theory. It's also almost certainly incomplete, if not outright wrong. Engineers have tried to replicate this process with modern materials and modern understanding, and the results have been underwhelming. A Japanese team once attempted to move a relatively modest 100-ton replica using ancient techniques. After considerable effort, expense, and probably some impressive profanity, they managed to move it about 50 meters before giving up. Keep in mind, the actual stones at Baalbek are 10 to 16 times heavier, and they were supposedly transported uphill over uneven terrain. The math doesn't math, as the kids say. Some researchers have proposed that the builders used a sophisticated system of levers and counterweights, perhaps combined with water-lubricated pathways to reduce friction. Others suggest that the stones were moved during winter months, when the ground was frozen and more slippery. These theories are interesting, and they might explain how smaller megalithic stones were moved elsewhere in the ancient world. But at Baalbek, we're not talking about 20-ton blocks or even 50-ton blocks. We're talking about stones that weigh as much as small naval vessels. At some point, the explanations start to feel less like science and more like wishful thinking. A desperate attempt to make the evidence fit our assumptions about what ancient people could and couldn't do. Here's where things get truly fascinating. The temple complex at Baalbek is Roman, but the foundation predates Rome by a considerable margin. How considerable? Nobody knows for sure. Some researchers believe the platform was constructed by earlier civilizations, possibly the Phoenicians, possibly the Canaanites, possibly someone else entirely whose name has been lost to history. The Romans, practical empire builders that they were, simply looked at this ready-made foundation of impossibly huge stones and thought, why build from scratch when someone else already did the heavy lifting? Literally. This raises an obvious question. If the Romans didn't build the foundation, who did? And more importantly, how? The local legends offer their own explanations, and they're considerably more colorful than anything in the archaeological literature. According to one tradition, the original temple at Baalbek was built by Cain. Yes, that Cain, the one from Genesis who had that unfortunate disagreement with his brother Abel. After his exile, Cain supposedly wandered the earth and eventually constructed this massive platform as a refuge from divine punishment. Another legend claims that the stones were moved by giants or jinn, supernatural beings who could lift enormous weights as easily as you or I might pick up a coffee cup. And then there's the inevitable ancient astronaut theory, which suggests that extraterrestrial visitors provided the technology necessary to move these megaliths. Now, before you roll your eyes so hard they get stuck, consider this. Sometimes the wildest explanations emerge not because people are credulous, but because the conventional explanations are so unsatisfying that anything seems more plausible. When mainstream science says, we used ropes and logs, and the evidence says, absolutely not, people start looking for alternatives. Some of those alternatives are silly, but the impulse behind them, the recognition that something doesn't add up, that impulse is entirely reasonable. What makes Baalbek particularly maddening for historians is the complete absence of contemporary documentation. We have detailed Roman records about the temple construction, who commissioned it, what gods it honored, how much the marble columns cost. But about the foundation? The massive platform that makes the whole complex possible? Silence. Not a single Roman text mentions how those stones got there or who put them in place. For a civilization that documented everything from military campaigns to grain shipments, this omission is striking. It's as if the Romans themselves didn't know, or didn't want to admit they didn't know, where the foundation came from. They built their temples on top of a mystery, and then politely pretended the mystery didn't exist. The precision of the stonework adds another layer to the puzzle. These aren't rough-hewn boulders piled haphazardly on top of each other. The blocks are cut with geometric accuracy, their surfaces smoothed, their edges squared. The joints between them are so tight that you cannot slip a piece of paper between the stones. This level of precision requires not just raw strength to move the materials, but sophisticated surveying tools to plan the cuts and advanced techniques to execute them. We're not talking about primitive construction here. We're talking about engineering that would be impressive by modern standards, accomplished by people using tools we haven't found and methods we can't reconstruct. Some archaeologists have attempted to date the foundation using various techniques, with results that range from controversial to hair-raising. One study suggested that the platform stones showed weathering patterns consistent with exposure to rainfall over many thousands of years, potentially placing their construction well before the Roman period. possibly even before the Bronze Age. If accurate, this would mean that the Baalbek Foundation was ancient when the Phoenicians arrived, ancient when the Egyptians were building their pyramids, ancient when writing itself was first invented. It would mean that somewhere in the mists of prehistory, a civilization existed with the capability to quarry, transport, and position stones weighing more than 1,000 tons, and then vanished so completely that we have no idea who they were. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate the sheer audacity of what we're discussing. Imagine you're an engineer in the 21st century. You have access to computer-aided design, satellite surveying, heavy machinery powered by diesel engines, steel cables capable of bearing incredible loads, and the collective knowledge of thousands of years of accumulated engineering expertise. Now imagine someone asks you to move a 1,600-ton stone block from a quarry to a construction site, position it with millimeter accuracy, and do it without damaging the block or yourself. You would need months of planning. You would need specialized equipment that doesn't exist off the shelf. Custom cranes, custom transporters, custom everything. You would need a budget measured in millions of dollars, and even then, success would not be guaranteed. Now strip away all of that technology. No cranes, no engines, no computers, no steel. Just human muscle, simple tools, and whatever ingenious methods you can devise. Could you do it? Could anyone? The builders of Baalbek apparently could. And they did it not once, but dozens of times, creating a platform so solid that it has survived earthquakes, invasions, and 2,000 years of weather without shifting an inch. The stones of Baalbek represent something genuinely uncomfortable for our understanding of history. They suggest that ancient peoples possessed capabilities we cannot replicate, and knowledge we cannot recover. This doesn't necessarily mean aliens, or giants, or supernatural intervention. It might simply mean that human ingenuity has peaks and valleys, that civilizations can achieve extraordinary things and then lose the ability to do so, that knowledge can be forgotten as easily as it can be discovered. We like to believe in progress, the comforting idea that each generation knows more than the last, that today is always smarter than yesterday. Baalbek challenges that assumption. It sits there in the Lebanese sun, massive and silent, reminding us that some things have been lost along the way. What else might those ancient builders have known? What other wonders might they have created? And why, when you look at those impossible stones, does a small voice in the back of your mind whisper that maybe, just maybe, we've forgotten more than we remember? The quarry where the stone of the pregnant woman still lies is open to visitors today. You can walk right up to it, touch its surface, marvel at its incomprehensible mass. Guides will tell you the standard story about ropes and rollers and determined workers. They'll smile politely when you point out that the explanation doesn't quite work. And then you'll stand there, looking at a rock that weighs more than most buildings, shaped with precision tools that no one can identify, prepared for a journey that never happened. And you'll realize that you're standing at the edge of a mystery that has no solution. Not yet, maybe not ever. The stones of Baalbek don't give up their secrets easily. They've been keeping them for a very, very long time. And whatever ancient hands shaped them, whatever lost technology moved them, whatever vanished civilization dreamed them into existence, all of that is gone now, leaving only the stones themselves as silent witnesses to achievements we can barely comprehend, let alone duplicate. From stones that shouldn't exist, let's move to maps that shouldn't be possible. Because if Baalbek makes engineers nervous, what we're about to discuss gives historians actual nightmares. We're entering the world of ancient cartography, where medieval mapmakers apparently had access to information that, according to everything we know about history, they absolutely should not have possessed. Welcome to the mystery of the Piri Reis map, a document so bewildering that it's been giving academics migraines since 1929. Here's the setup. The year is 1513. Christopher Columbus has been dead for 7 years. Magellan hasn't circumnavigated the globe yet. That won't happen for another 8 years. The southern tip of South America is barely known to Europeans. And Antarctica? Antarctica won't be officially discovered for another 3 centuries. In 1513, the frozen continent at the bottom of the world exists only in the vague theories of ancient philosophers who suspected there might be land down there to balance the northern landmasses. Nobody has seen it. Nobody has mapped it. Nobody has any concrete information about its coastline, its shape, or its geography. Or so we thought. Enter Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral with an impressive beard and an even more impressive map collection. In 1513, Race compiled a world map in Constantinople, drawing on various sources he had accumulated over his career. The map itself is a work of art, beautifully illustrated with ships, animals, and elaborate compass roses. It shows the western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and various Atlantic islands with reasonable accuracy for its time. So far, so normal. But then there's the bottom portion of the map, and that's where things get genuinely weird. The southern section of the Piri-Reis map depicts a landmass that looks suspiciously like the northern coastline of Antarctica. Not Antarctica as we see it today, a frozen wasteland buried under miles of ice, but Antarctica as it might appear if you stripped away the glaciers and revealed the actual rock beneath. The coastline shown on this 1513 map corresponds, with uncomfortable accuracy, to the subglacial topography of Queen Maud Land, a region of Antarctica that wasn't properly surveyed until the 1950s using seismic equipment and satellite imaging. How did a 16th century Ottoman admiral draw a coastline that was buried under ice? A coastline that no human being could have seen for at least 6,000 years since the last time that region was ice-free. Piri-Reis himself provided an explanation in the map's margins. He noted that he compiled his map from approximately 20 source charts, including some that dated back to the time of Alexander the Great, the 4th century BC. He claimed that some of these ancient sources showed lands and coastlines that were already considered mysterious and poorly understood even in Alexander's day. In other words, Reis wasn't claiming to have personally visited Antarctica or possessed magical geographic knowledge. He was copying from older maps. Much, much older maps. Maps that had been passed down, copied, and recopied through centuries, possibly millennia of transmission. The obvious question is, where did those original maps come from? Who surveyed Antarctica's coastline when it was still free of ice? And how did that information survive into the medieval period? The skeptics have answers, naturally. Some researchers argue that the Antarctic coastline on the Piri-Reis map is actually just the South American coast, distorted and extended southward due to incomplete information. Others suggest it might represent the coast of Patagonia or even Terra del Fuego, drawn with considerable artistic license. These explanations are plausible, and they might even be correct. But they don't quite account for the specificity of the coastline's features, which match the subglacial topography with a precision that's difficult to attribute to random chance or creative guesswork. And here's the thing. The Piri-Reis map isn't alone. It's part of a larger pattern of medieval and Renaissance maps that contain geographical information that their creators shouldn't have known. The Orontius Phineas map of 1531 shows Antarctica as a distinct continent, 18 years after the Piri-Reis map, and still nearly 300 years before its official discovery. The Mercator map of 1538 depicts the Antarctic coastline with remarkable accuracy. The Philippe Buache map of 1737 shows Antarctica without ice, revealing a landmass divided by a waterway, a feature that wasn't confirmed until modern seismic surveys revealed that Antarctica is indeed two separate landmasses connected by ice. These cartographers weren't working together. They lived in different countries, different centuries, different intellectual traditions. Yet they all seem to have had access to the same mysterious source material, ancient maps depicting a world that no longer exists, drawn by surveyors whose identities have been lost to time. The implications are staggering if you take them seriously. For someone to have accurately mapped Antarctica's coastline, they would have needed to visit the continent during a period when it was ice-free, or at least ice-reduced. Geologically speaking, this means either before the current ice age began, roughly 34 million years ago, which is obviously impossible for human mapmakers, or during a brief interglacial warm period. The most recent time Antarctica might have had significantly reduced ice cover in certain regions was around 6,000 years ago, during the Holocene climatic optimum. This was before the Egyptian pyramids, before Stonehenge, before written history in most of the world. If humans mapped Antarctica during this window, they would have needed ocean-going vessels capable of reaching the southern polar regions, navigation techniques sophisticated enough to survey coastlines accurately, and a method of recording and preserving this information across thousands of years. In other words, they would have needed a level of technological civilization that mainstream archaeology says didn't exist. Some researchers, most notably Charles Hapgood in his 1966 book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, argued that these anomalous maps are evidence of a lost maritime civilization, a seafaring culture that existed before the established cradles of civilization in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and that was destroyed by some catastrophe, leaving only fragmentary records that were copied and preserved by later cultures without full understanding of their significance. Hapgood's theory was considered fringe when he proposed it, and it remains controversial today. But it's worth noting that Albert Einstein himself wrote a favorable foreword to Hapgood's earlier book on Earth crust displacement, lending at least some intellectual credibility to his unconventional thinking. The lost civilization hypothesis isn't proven, but it's not easily dismissed either. Something accounts for these maps. Something explains how medieval cartographers drew coastlines they never saw. Whether that something is a lost civilization, an unknown chain of transmission from ancient sources, or simply a series of remarkable coincidences, remains one of history's most tantalizing unsolved puzzles. The Piri Reis map survives today in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul, where you can see it displayed under glass, looking innocent and decorative, giving absolutely no indication that it represents one of the most confounding documents in the history of cartography. Most visitors walk past it without a second glance. They don't know that this fragile piece of gazelle parchment contains geographic information that shouldn't exist, drawn from sources that shouldn't have survived, depicting a continent that no one should have seen. The Ottoman admiral who compiled it died in 1553, executed for failing to lift the Portuguese siege of Hormuz. He never explained where his ancient source maps came from, or what happened to them after he finished his compilation. Like so many threads in this mystery, they simply vanished, leaving us with more questions than answers, and a coastline that haunts the dreams of anyone who looks at it too closely. From maps that show impossible knowledge, let's turn to objects that demonstrate impossible technology. Because apparently, the ancient world wasn't content just knowing things they shouldn't. They also built things they couldn't, or at least, things we assume they couldn't. Meet the artifacts that make metallurgists weep and historians throw up their hands in defeat. First stop, Delhi, India, where a single iron pillar has been standing in the open air for approximately 1,600 years, doing something that iron absolutely should not do. It's not rusting. Let that sink in for a moment. Iron rusts. That's what iron does. Leave an iron nail outside for a few months and it'll start turning orange. Leave it for a few years and it'll crumble into powder. That's basic chemistry. Iron plus oxygen plus water equals rust, equals eventual disintegration. This is why we paint bridges and coat cars in protective finishes, and generally go to enormous trouble to keep iron away from the atmosphere. But this pillar in Delhi has been standing in monsoon rains, tropical humidity, and pollution for 16 centuries, and it looks like it was forged last week. Good luck explaining that one with a straight face. The Iron Pillar of Delhi stands in the Qutub complex, surrounded by medieval Islamic architecture that was built around it because even the Muslim conquerors who arrived in the 12th century recognized they were looking at something remarkable. The pillar is about 7 meters tall and weighs over 6 tons, covered in Sanskrit inscriptions that date its creation to the reign of Chandragupta II, sometime around 400 AD. The inscriptions celebrate military victories and devotion to the Hindu god Vishnu. Standard ancient monument stuff. What's not standard is the metallurgy. Modern analysis has revealed that the pillar is made of remarkably pure iron, about 98% pure, which is extraordinary for ancient smelting techniques. But purity alone doesn't explain the rust resistance. The secret, scientists eventually discovered, lies in a thin layer of a compound called misawite that formed on the pillar's surface over time. This protective film, only about 1/20th of a millimeter thick, acts as a barrier against corrosion. The formation of this layer was apparently aided by the specific composition of the iron, which contains higher than usual levels of phosphorus, an impurity that would normally be considered a defect, but in this case proved to be exactly what was needed for long-term preservation. Here's what makes this genuinely remarkable. The ancient Indian blacksmiths who created this pillar couldn't have known about misawite. The compound wasn't identified or understood until the 20th century. They couldn't have deliberately created the phosphorus-rich iron composition through any known ancient technique, or at least any technique we've been able to reconstruct. They couldn't have predicted that their pillar would stand for 16 centuries without corroding, and yet it does. Either they got spectacularly lucky, stumbling onto a corrosion-resistant formula by pure chance, or they possessed metallurgical knowledge that we haven't fully recovered. Ancient texts describe iron-making processes in India that involved repeated heating and hammering, but none of these texts explain how to achieve the specific composition that makes the Delhi pillar so remarkable. The knowledge, if it ever existed in explicit form, has been lost. And speaking of lost knowledge, Let's travel from India to Greece, specifically to a shipwreck off the coast of a small island called Antikythera. In 1901, sponge divers exploring the wreck pulled up various bronze statues and artifacts, standard Mediterranean archaeological fare. But among the treasures was something that didn't fit any known category. A corroded lump of bronze and wood that initially baffled researchers. It was only decades later, after X-ray analysis and painstaking reconstruction, that scientists realized what they were looking at: the world's oldest known analog computer. The Antikythera mechanism, as it's now called, dates to approximately 100 BC, give or take a few decades. It contains at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, precision machined to interact in specific mathematical relationships. When operated by a hand crank, the mechanism could calculate the positions of the sun and moon, predict lunar and solar eclipses, track the cycles of the Olympic Games, and model the motions of the 5 planets known to the ancient Greeks: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. All of this in a device roughly the size of a shoebox, built over 2,000 years before the invention of the mechanical clock. Let's put this in perspective. In 100 BC, the Roman Republic was still fighting civil wars. Julius Caesar was a teenager. The Han Dynasty ruled China, and the Silk Road was just beginning to facilitate trade between East and West. The technological landscape included basic metalworking, simple machines like levers and pulleys, and whatever engineering knowledge had survived from the Greeks and Egyptians. What the technological landscape did not include, according to everything historians thought they knew, was precision gear-based computing devices. The level of mechanical sophistication displayed by the Antikythera mechanism wouldn't be seen again in the historical record until the astronomical clocks of medieval Europe, roughly 1,400 years later. For over a millennium, humanity apparently forgot how to build such devices, or never knew how in the first place if the mechanism was a one-off creation by an unparalleled genius. The craftsmanship is extraordinary even by modern standards. The gears are cut with teeth so fine and regular that they required magnification to manufacture. Yet the ancient Greeks had no magnifying lenses, at least none that have survived in the archaeological record. The mathematical relationships encoded in the gear ratios are sophisticated enough that researchers are still discovering new functions built into the device. Recent studies suggest it may have included features we haven't fully decoded yet, hidden complexities that await future analysis. This wasn't primitive technology. This was advanced engineering, created by someone who understood mathematics, astronomy, and precision manufacturing at a level that supposedly didn't exist for another millennium and a half. Who built it? We don't know. Where did they learn? We don't know. Were there other mechanisms like it? Almost certainly. You don't create something this sophisticated as a first attempt, but no others have been found. The knowledge required to design and build the Antikythera mechanism, the mathematical principles, the gear-cutting techniques, the astronomical models, all of it vanished so completely that when European clockmakers finally redeveloped similar technology in the 14th century, they had to figure it out from scratch. No ancient manuscripts describing such devices have survived. No workshop debris, no half-finished prototypes, no training manuals. Just one corroded artifact sitting at the bottom of the Mediterranean for 2,000 years, waiting to be discovered by sponge divers who had no idea what they'd found. Both of these artifacts, the rustless pillar and the ancient computer, share a disturbing characteristic. They demonstrate technological knowledge that appeared, accomplished remarkable things, and then vanished without a trace. The Indian blacksmiths who created rust-resistant iron didn't pass their techniques to future generations, or if they did, the knowledge degraded and disappeared. The Greek engineers who built the Antikythera mechanism left no students, no school, no tradition of precision clockwork. In both cases, humanity achieved something extraordinary and then promptly forgot how to do it. This pattern challenges our comfortable assumption that technology always progresses forward. We like to believe that knowledge accumulates, that each generation builds on the discoveries of the last, that the march of human ingenuity is ever upward. But history tells a different story. Knowledge can be lost. Entire technologies can vanish when the civilizations that created them collapse, when wars destroy libraries, when plagues kill craftsmen before they can train apprentices. The ancient world may have contained wonders we can barely imagine, machines, techniques, materials that existed briefly and then disappeared into the void of forgotten history. The Delhi pillar and the Antikythera mechanism are the survivors, The lucky few artifacts that somehow made it through the millennia intact enough for us to marvel at them. How many others were lost? How many ancient achievements have crumbled to dust, leaving no trace that they ever existed? These are questions that keep archaeologists awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what else might be buried out there, waiting to overturn everything we think we know. We've seen stones too heavy to move and metals too advanced to explain. Now let's talk about something even more audacious. Entire buildings carved not from blocks of stone assembled piece by piece, but from solid rock, sculpted from the top down like the world's most ambitious ice sculpture, except made of basalt and created by people who apparently had no concept of the word impossible. Welcome to the realm of monolithic architecture, where ancient builders looked at mountains and thought, you know what? I could make that into a temple. The Kailasa Temple at Ellora in India isn't a building in any conventional sense. It's a subtraction. Imagine standing on top of a cliff and carving downward, removing everything that isn't temple, until you're left with a three-dimensional structure complete with columns, bridges, windows, and intricate sculptures, all from a single piece of rock. No cranes, no heavy machinery, no way to fix mistakes because once you chisel away the wrong piece, it's gone forever. This isn't architecture. This is controlled demolition in reverse. And the fact that it exists at all should make every modern engineer feel profoundly inadequate. The numbers are staggering. The temple complex covers an area twice the size of the Parthenon in Athens and stands about 30 meters tall. To create it, workers removed approximately 200,000 tons of rock. That's around 400 million pounds of basalt, carved away with hand tools over a period that historians estimate at somewhere between 18 and 100 years. The uncertainty in that timeline tells you everything you need to know about how little we actually understand about this project. We're not even sure which century it was built in, let alone how long it took. The commonly accepted date is around the 8th century AD, during the reign of Krishna, one of the Rashtrakuta dynasty. But some researchers argue that the temple shows signs of multiple construction phases, possibly spanning several centuries and several dynasties. Here's what makes Kailasa truly mind-bending. The construction had to proceed from top to bottom. You can't build scaffolding inside a structure that doesn't exist yet, and you can't carve the lower portions until you've removed the rock above them. This means the architects had to have the entire design perfectly planned before the first chisel struck stone. Every column, every sculpture, every decorative detail had to be calculated in advance because there was no room for revision. If you carved a pillar too thin, you couldn't add material back. If you misjudged the proportions of a hall, you couldn't tear it down and start over. The rock only goes one direction, away, and once it's gone, it's gone. Modern architects work with computer modeling software that can simulate thousands of design iterations before construction begins. The builders of Kailasa had, what exactly? Drawings on palm leaves? Mental visualization? Some unknown planning technique that's been lost to history? Whatever method they used, it worked flawlessly. The temple stands today as a testament to engineering precision that borders on the supernatural. The sculptural details are equally impressive. The temple is covered with elaborate carvings depicting scenes from Hindu mythology, gods, demons, celestial beings, and epic battles rendered in stone with remarkable artistry. These aren't rough outlines or simplified figures. They're fully three-dimensional sculptures with flowing garments, detailed jewelry, and expressive faces, all carved in place from the living rock. The level of artistic skill required is extraordinary, but it's the logistical coordination that truly boggles the mind. Hundreds, possibly thousands of workers must have labored simultaneously on different sections of the temple, each following the master plan with perfect precision, never making an error significant enough to derail the entire project. In an age without telephones, without printed blueprints, without standardized measurements, they achieved a consistency of execution that modern construction crews would struggle to match. And then there's the question of the missing debris. 200,000 tons of rock had to go somewhere. You can't just vaporize basalt. It has to be physically removed, transported away from the site, and deposited elsewhere. Where did it all go? The area around Ellora shows no obvious signs of massive rock dumps or construction debris. Some researchers suggest the removed stone was used for other building projects, but 200,000 tons is an enormous amount of material. You could build multiple cities with that much rock. Yet there's no clear archaeological evidence of where it ended up. The stone was carved, removed, and apparently vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the temple itself as proof that it ever existed. Now let's travel east to China, where an equally mysterious excavation awaits, one that makes even less sense than Kailasa, because at least we know who built the Indian temple and roughly when. The Longyu caves have no such documentation. None at all. These massive underground chambers were apparently carved in secret, used for unknown purposes, and then abandoned and forgotten for over 2,000 years until a farmer stumbled upon them in 1992. The Longyu caves are located in Zhejiang province, near the village of Xi'an Beikun. For centuries, locals knew about several ponds in the area that seemed unusually deep and never dried up even during droughts. In 1992, a villager named Wu Anai became curious about these mysterious pools and organized an effort to pump one of them dry. What emerged from beneath the water was not a natural cavern, but a massive hand-carved chamber with smooth walls, regular columns, and precise geometric proportions. Further exploration revealed not one, but 24 similar caves, together encompassing over 30,000 square meters of underground space, roughly the area of 5 football fields, all carved from solid sandstone. The scale of labor involved is almost incomprehensible. Engineers estimate that creating these caves would have required removing approximately 1 million cubic meters of rock. Working continuously, this would have taken 1,000 people working around the clock for about 6 years, and that's a conservative estimate. The caves feature uniform chisel marks covering every surface, creating a distinctive pattern that suggests a highly organized workforce following strict procedures. The columns that support the ceilings are precisely positioned to bear the load of the rock above, indicating sophisticated understanding of structural engineering. Some chambers have ceilings that rise over 30 meters, with walls that slope at exact angles. This wasn't random digging. This was architectural planning on a massive scale. But here's the truly bizarre part. There's no historical record of these caves. None. China has one of the most continuous written histories of any civilization on Earth, stretching back thousands of years. Chinese scholars documented everything from imperial decrees to local crop yields, from astronomical observations to folk remedies. They recorded the construction of the Great Wall, the Grand Canal, countless temples and palaces. Yet somehow, the creation of 24 massive underground chambers, a project that would have required thousands of workers, years of effort, and enormous resources, went completely unmentioned. No imperial records describe commissioning them. No local chronicles discuss their construction. No legends or folk tales explain their purpose. For over 2 millennia, these caves sat beneath the water, forgotten by history, until a curious farmer decided to see what was at the bottom of his village pond. Various theories have been proposed. Some researchers suggest the caves were quarries, carved to extract stone for other construction projects. But the extracted rock hasn't been traced to any known buildings, and the artistic care taken with the interior walls seems excessive for a mere quarry. Others propose they were hiding places during times of war, underground refuges where civilians could shelter from invading armies. But the caves have no defensive features, no provisions for long-term habitation, no evidence of ever being used as shelters. Still others suggest religious or ceremonial purposes, but no altars, inscriptions, or artifacts have been found that would indicate ritual use. The caves are simply empty, vast, precisely carved, and completely devoid of any clue about why they exist. What links Kailasa and Longyu is the absence of the things we'd expect to find. Where are the tools? Carving hundreds of thousands of tons of rock should leave behind worn chisels, broken hammers, abandoned equipment. Where are the plans? Projects of this scale require detailed blueprints, measurements, diagrams. Where are the administrative records? You can't coordinate thousands of workers without payrolls, supply lists, organizational documents. In both cases, the physical evidence of the construction process has vanished as completely as if it never existed. We have the results, these astonishing monuments to human ambition and skill, but the paper trail, the tool debris, the mundane bureaucratic records that should accompany any major building project have all disappeared. It's as if someone carved these wonders and then methodically erased every trace of how they did it, leaving future generations to marvel and speculate without ever quite understanding. From structures without explanations, let's move to documents without meanings. Because apparently, the ancient world also enjoyed leaving us books we can't read, messages we can't decode, and information that sits right in front of us, tantalizingly detailed, utterly incomprehensible. Welcome to the world of uncracked codes and unsolved scripts, where the smartest cryptographers on Earth have spent decades staring at pages of text and achieved absolutely nothing. Not exactly a confidence booster for human intelligence, but fascinating nonetheless. The Voynich manuscript is probably the most famous unreadable book in history, and it has earned that reputation through sheer stubborn resistance to every attempt at decipherment. This medieval document, currently housed at Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book Library, consists of approximately 240 pages of handwritten text in an unknown alphabet, accompanied by bizarre illustrations of unidentified plants, astronomical diagrams, and naked women bathing in green liquid connected by elaborate plumbing systems. Yes, you read that correctly. The illustrations alone would make this one of the strangest books ever created. But combined with the undecipherable text, it becomes something genuinely unique, a puzzle that has defeated everyone who has attempted to solve it. The manuscript is named after Wilfrid Voynich, a Polish book dealer who purchased it in 1912 from a collection of books owned by the Jesuits. Carbon dating has established that the vellum pages were made sometime between 1404 and 1438, placing the document firmly in the early 15th century. The ink and paints appear consistent with this dating, suggesting the book is genuinely medieval rather than a later forgery. But here's where things get complicated. Nobody knows who wrote it, what language it's written in, what the text actually says, or what purpose the book was supposed to serve. After more than a century of study by historians, linguists, cryptographers, and amateur codebreakers, we know almost nothing more than we did when Voynich first acquired it. The text of the manuscript follows patterns that suggest it's a genuine language rather than random gibberish. Statistical analysis shows that the symbols follow consistent rules. Certain characters appear only at the beginnings of words, others only at the ends, and the distribution of symbol frequencies resembles natural languages. The text contains no obvious errors or corrections, suggesting the writer was fluent in whatever system they were using. But no one has been able to match the script to any known alphabet, historical or modern. It's not a cipher based on Latin, Greek, Hebrew, or Arabic. It's not any known medieval secret writing system. It's not a constructed language that follows recognizable grammatical principles. Whatever it is, it appears to be unique. The illustrations offer no help and may actually make things worse. The botanical section contains drawings of plants that don't correspond to any known species. Some appear to be composites, combining roots from one plant with leaves from another and flowers from a third, creating organisms that couldn't exist in nature. The astronomical diagrams show circular arrangements that might represent zodiac signs or celestial phenomena, but they don't match any known astronomical traditions. The famous bathing women sections depict female figures in pools connected by tubes and channels, engaged in activities that defy interpretation. Are these medical diagrams? Religious symbolism? Instructions for some unknown procedure? Nobody knows. The images seem designed to convey information, but without the text to explain them, they remain as mysterious as the words themselves. The manuscript has attracted some of history's most brilliant minds, all of whom have failed to crack it. During World War II, American and British codebreakers who had successfully deciphered enemy communications took a crack at the Voynich manuscript and got nowhere. William Friedman, considered the father of American cryptanalysis, the man who broke the Japanese purple cipher, spent decades studying the manuscript without success. More recently, computer scientists have applied artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms to the text, analyzing patterns that would be impossible for humans to detect. The result? More theories, no definitive answers. The manuscript has been solved dozens of times in academic papers and newspaper headlines, but each proposed solution has been challenged, criticized, and ultimately rejected by other researchers. The code, if it is a code, remains unbroken. Some scholars have suggested the manuscript might be an elaborate hoax, a meaningless jumble of symbols designed to fool wealthy collectors into paying for a magical or alchemical text. But the statistical regularities in the text argue against this. Creating 200 pages of fake language that consistently follows internal rules would be extraordinarily difficult, especially in the 15th century. Other researchers propose that the manuscript is written in a natural language, using a unique alphabet, possibly representing a dialect or linguistic tradition that has since died out. Still others suggest it might be a form of shorthand or abbreviation system that made sense to its creator but appears cryptic to outsiders. None of these theories has been proven, and the manuscript continues to sit in its climate-controlled case at Yale, silently refusing to give up its secrets. From one unreadable document, let's turn to another, though this one is made of copper rather than vellum and contains information that might actually be valuable, assuming anyone could figure out what it means. The Copper Scroll is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1952 in a cave near Qumran in the West Bank. Unlike the other Dead Sea Scrolls, which are religious and literary texts written on parchment or papyrus, the Copper Scroll is exactly what its name suggests, a document inscribed on sheets of copper that were rolled up like a scroll. And unlike the spiritual teachings and biblical commentaries found in the other scrolls, this one appears to be a treasure map. The scroll lists 64 locations where gold, silver, and other valuables were supposedly hidden. The descriptions are specific. So many talents of gold buried under the steps of a particular building. So many silver vessels hidden in a cistern beneath a specific courtyard. So many coins concealed behind a wall in a named location. The total treasure described amounts to thousands of talents of precious metals, an enormous fortune by ancient standards, worth billions in modern currency if it actually exists. But here's the problem. Nobody can find any of it. The locations described in the Copper Scroll use place names and landmarks that don't correspond to any known sites. References to the Fortress of the Valley, the Reservoir of Solomon, and the Garden of Zadok might have been perfectly clear to someone living in 1st century Judea, but today they're meaningless. Archaeological expeditions have searched for the treasure based on various interpretations of the text, and all have come up empty. Either the treasure was removed long ago, or the locations have been misidentified, or the entire scroll is some kind of elaborate fiction whose purpose we don't understand. Some scholars have suggested the Copper Scroll might describe temple treasure hidden before the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Wealth from the Second Temple secreted away by priests who knew their world was about to end. Others propose it might be a record of Essene community funds, or even a mythological text describing legendary treasures that never actually existed. What makes the Copper Scroll particularly tantalizing is its materiality. Someone went to considerable trouble and expense to inscribe this text on copper rather than parchment. Copper is permanent in a way that organic materials are not. It won't rot, burn easily, or decay over time. Whoever created this scroll wanted it to survive. They wanted future readers to find it and understand it. They crafted it from metal specifically so the information would endure through centuries, millennia if necessary. And it has endured. The text is perfectly legible. The locations are clearly listed. The treasure quantities are precisely specified. Everything you would need to find an enormous fortune is right there, preserved exactly as the ancient writer intended. Except for the one thing that would make it useful: context. The scroll assumes knowledge that its readers no longer possess, references a geography that no longer exists, and describes a world that vanished 2,000 years ago. Both documents, the Voynich manuscript and the Copper Scroll, embody the same frustrating paradox. They clearly contain information. They were created with care and intention, preserved through centuries, and survived to reach us in readable condition. But the meaning has been lost. The key that would unlock their secrets, whether a linguistic system, a geographical framework, or some other piece of cultural knowledge, has disappeared, leaving us with messages we can see but cannot understand. Somewhere in those pages is knowledge that someone desperately wanted to preserve, and we may never know what it is. From texts we cannot read, let's descend into tombs we dare not open. Because the ancient world wasn't satisfied with simply leaving us puzzles, it also left us warnings. Sealed chambers that have remained untouched for millennia. Not because we lack the technology to enter them, but because we're genuinely terrified of what might happen if we do. Welcome to the realm of forbidden archaeology, where the question isn't, can we open this? But should we? Let's start with the big one. The tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of unified China, has been sitting beneath a massive earthen mound in Shaanxi province for over 2,000 years. We know exactly where it is. We have ground-penetrating radar images of its structure. We could theoretically excavate it anytime we wanted. And yet, the Chinese government has consistently refused to open the burial chamber. And most archaeologists agree this is probably wise. The reason? Ancient texts describe what's inside, and the descriptions read less like a burial site and more like a Bond villain's lair. According to the historian Sima Qian, writing about a century after the emperor's death, the tomb contains a miniature model of the entire Chinese empire, complete with rivers and seas made of flowing mercury. Yes, liquid mercury. Pools and channels of the toxic metal, simulating the Yellow River and the Yangtze, flowing through an underground recreation of the realm Qin Shi Huang conquered and unified. The ceiling was supposedly decorated with pearls representing the stars, while the floor mapped out the geography of China in exquisite detail. Crossbows were rigged to fire automatically at anyone who entered uninvited. Ancient booby traps designed to protect the emperor's eternal rest. For centuries, scholars assumed these descriptions were exaggerated legend, the kind of mythological embellishment that accumulates around powerful rulers after their deaths. Then modern scientists started testing the soil around the burial mound. The mercury levels are off the charts. Seriously, soil samples from the area surrounding the tomb show concentrations of mercury that are dozens of times higher than normal background levels. The pattern of contamination corresponds roughly to where the rivers would flow if Sima Qian's description is accurate. This means either the ancient historian was telling the truth, or someone centuries ago went to enormous trouble to contaminate the soil in a pattern that would validate his account, which seems considerably less likely. The mercury seas appear to be real, and if that part of the description is accurate, what about the rest? The tomb is enormous, an underground complex that dwarfs any burial site ever excavated. The famous Terracotta Army, those 8,000 life-sized clay soldiers discovered in 1974, are just the outer guard. They're not even inside the main tomb. They're peripheral, a welcoming committee for the afterlife, positioned in pits outside the central burial mound. The actual tomb, where the emperor himself lies, remains sealed. Chinese authorities have cited preservation concerns as the primary reason for not excavating. Mercury contamination would pose serious health risks to workers, and exposure to air could damage artifacts that have been sealed in a stable environment for 2 millennia. These are legitimate concerns. But there's also something else, something harder to articulate. The sense that some things were meant to stay closed. Qin Shi Huang was not a gentle ruler. He unified China through brutal warfare, burning books and executing scholars who disagreed with him, standardizing weights, measures, and writing through imperial decree rather than consensus. He was obsessed with immortality, sending expeditions to find the legendary islands of the immortals and consuming mercury-laced elixirs in the belief they would extend his life. The irony that mercury probably hastened his death rather than prevented it has not been lost on historians. He built the Great Wall, or at least began the process of connecting earlier fortifications into a continuous barrier at the cost of countless lives. And he constructed his tomb as a final monument to his power, an underground empire where he could rule forever, protected by mechanical guardians and rivers of poison. The Chinese have a concept called feng shui, the practice of arranging spaces to harmonize with spiritual forces. Disturbing a tomb, especially one as elaborate and deliberately protected as Qin Shi Huang's, carries implications beyond the merely archaeological. There's a cultural hesitation, a sense that opening this particular seal might release more than just mercury vapor. Is that superstition? Probably. But when you're standing above a 2,000-year-old booby-trapped underground palace filled with toxic metals, built by a megalomaniac emperor who believed he could cheat death itself, superstition starts to feel like reasonable caution. Now let's travel west to Egypt, Alexandria specifically, where a very different kind of sealed burial made headlines in 2018. Construction workers digging a foundation for a new building struck something unexpected. A massive black granite sarcophagus, the largest ever discovered in Alexandria, buried beneath layers of earth and rubble. The sarcophagus weighed 30 tons and was sealed with mortar, apparently untouched since it was closed sometime around the Ptolemaic period, roughly 2,000 years ago. The internet naturally went absolutely insane. Speculation ran wild. Was this Alexander the Great himself, whose final resting place has never been definitively located? A forgotten pharaoh? A high priest with secrets that could rewrite history? The black granite and the sheer size of the sarcophagus suggested someone of extreme importance. The sealed mortar indicated no one had opened it in 2 millennia. This was, potentially, the archaeological find of the century. Excitement built. Theories multiplied. And then, they opened it. Inside were 3 skeletons floating in a reddish-brown liquid that smelled absolutely terrible. The liquid, which some observers initially speculated might be blood or some kind of ritual substance, turned out to be sewage water that had seeped in through a crack in the sarcophagus over the centuries. The skeletons belonged to 3 individuals, probably soldiers based on their bone injuries, who had been buried together for reasons that remain unclear. No treasure, no mummies wrapped in golden masks, No scrolls containing lost wisdom. Just 3 dead soldiers marinating in ancient sewage for 2,000 years. Not exactly the blockbuster discovery everyone was hoping for. But here's the thing. Even in its anticlimactic reality, the black sarcophagus raises fascinating questions. Why were 3 soldiers given such an elaborate burial? The sarcophagus was massive and expensive, not the kind of coffin you'd use for ordinary infantry. One of the skeletons showed evidence of trepanation, a hole deliberately drilled in the skull, possibly as a medical treatment or possibly for unknown ritual purposes. Who were these men? What did they do to merit such an unusual final resting place? And why was the sarcophagus sealed so carefully, as if its contents were precious, when it apparently contained nothing but bodies? The internet's reaction to the opening was almost as interesting as the tomb itself. Within hours of the announcement that the sarcophagus contained sewage water, a petition appeared online, demanding that people be allowed to drink the liquid. Yes, really. Over 30,000 people signed a petition requesting permission to consume 2,000-year-old corpse water on the theory that it might contain magical properties or grant immortality. This is the species that split the atom and landed on the moon, folks. We contain multitudes. But beneath the absurdity lies something genuine, a hunger for mystery, a desire for the ancient world to contain secrets that overturn our understanding of reality. When the black sarcophagus was discovered, people wanted it to be something extraordinary. They wanted Alexander, or a lost pharaoh, or at minimum some impressive grave goods. The reality, 3 anonymous soldiers, some bones, and contaminated water, felt like a letdown precisely because it was ordinary. The ancient world, it turns out, was full of ordinary people doing ordinary things, and not every sealed container holds earth-shattering revelations. And yet the Qin Shi Huang tomb remains sealed. The Mercury rivers, if they exist, continue to flow in eternal darkness beneath the Chinese countryside. The automatic crossbows, if they were ever real, may still be loaded and waiting. Whatever else is down there, the miniature empire, the pearl-studded ceiling, the secrets that a paranoid emperor took to his grave, remains unknown. Some seals, it seems, are more reluctant to give up their contents than others. There are other sealed tombs scattered around the world, other burial chambers that have never been opened or were sealed again after brief exploration. The tomb of the first Qin emperor is merely the most famous. Across cultures and centuries, humans have consistently tried to protect their dead from disturbance, whether through physical barriers, supernatural warnings, or elaborate deceptions. The Egyptians filled their tombs with curses. The Chinese installed mechanical traps. Medieval Europeans buried their important dead in massive stone sarcophagi that would require significant effort to move. All of these measures share a common assumption, that the dead deserve peace, and that the living should think twice before violating it. Modern archaeology has largely abandoned the tomb-raiding mentality of earlier centuries. Today's researchers are more likely to use non-invasive techniques, ground-penetrating radar, chemical analysis of soil, 3D modeling, than to simply break through sealed doors and see what's inside. This isn't just about respecting the dead, though that's part of it. It's about recognizing that once you open a sealed environment, you can't close it again. Whatever was preserved by 2,000 years of isolation will begin to decay the moment air and light reach it. The act of discovery becomes the act of destruction. Better, sometimes, to leave the seal intact and wonder what lies behind it, than to open the door and watch the contents crumble to dust. The tombs that remain sealed represent a special category of mystery. Unlike the Voynich manuscript, which we can examine freely even if we can't understand it, or the stones of Baalbek, which we can measure and analyze from every angle, these are puzzles we've chosen not to solve. The answers exist. They're right there, underground, waiting. But we've decided that the cost of obtaining them is too high. The mercury might be real. The traps might still work. The knowledge might not survive exposure to the modern world. And so we leave the seals unbroken, the questions unanswered, the dead undisturbed in their elaborate eternal homes. Perhaps that's the wisest approach. Perhaps some secrets are better left buried. But there's also something deeply human about the urge to open every door, solve every puzzle, illuminate every shadow. We are a curious species, and curiosity has driven most of our greatest achievements. The tension between wanting to know and respecting the boundaries set by those who came before us. That tension defines much of archaeology, and it reaches its most acute form when we stand before a sealed tomb, knowing that the answers lie just beyond the stone, wondering whether we have the right to claim them. For now, Qin Shi Huang sleeps beneath his Mercury rivers, guarded by crossbows that may or may not still function, surrounded by an empire built for eternity. His secrets remain his own. And somewhere in Alexandria, the mystery of the black sarcophagus. Not what was inside, but why those 3 soldiers were buried with such ceremony, continues to puzzle researchers who expected treasure and found only bones. The sealed tombs of the ancient world remind us that not all questions have satisfying answers, and not all mysteries are meant to be solved. Sometimes the seal itself is the message. Here lies something that someone, long ago, desperately wanted to protect. The least we can do is wonder why. From tombs that guard their secrets, let's venture into territory that challenges everything we think we know about human civilization itself. Because here's the thing about history. It has a starting point. There's a line, somewhat fuzzy admittedly, before which humans were supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers, wandering the landscape in small bands, barely scraping by, and after which they suddenly figured out farming, built cities, invented writing, and generally became civilized. This transition happened around 10 to 12,000 years ago, give or take, and it's supposed to explain everything. First came agriculture, then came surplus food, then came permanent settlements, then came temples and kings and alphabets. Nice, neat, logical. Except the archaeological record increasingly suggests this tidy narrative might be completely wrong. Welcome to Göbekli Tepe, the site that broke archaeology's brain. Located in southeastern Turkey, about 15 kilometers from the city of Şanlıurfa, Göbekli Tepe is a hilltop covered with massive stone circles featuring T-shaped pillars up to 6 meters tall, carved with elaborate reliefs of animals, lions, bulls, foxes, snakes, scorpions, and birds. The pillars weigh up to 20 tons each. They're arranged in precise geometric patterns. They show evidence of sophisticated planning and coordinated labor involving hundreds of workers. And they were built approximately 12,000 years ago, during a period when humans were supposedly still living in caves and hunting mammoths with pointy sticks. Let's put that timeline in perspective. Göbekli Tepe predates Stonehenge by about 6,000 years. It predates the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000 years. It predates the invention of the wheel, the domestication of horses, the development of writing, and the emergence of what we traditionally call civilization in Mesopotamia. According to the standard historical model, the people who built Göbekli Tepe shouldn't have existed. They were hunter-gatherers, nomadic bands without permanent settlements, without organized religion, without the social complexity required to coordinate massive construction projects. And yet here it is, carved in stone, impossible to ignore. A monumental temple complex built by people who had no business building anything. The site was actually discovered in 1963 by a joint team from Istanbul University and the University of Chicago. But they dismissed it as a medieval cemetery and moved on. It wasn't until 1994 that German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt recognized what he was looking at and began systematic excavations. What he found challenged the fundamental assumptions of his field. The conventional wisdom held that religion emerged as a result of settled agricultural life. First you grow crops, then you have time for philosophy. Göbekli Tepe inverted this completely. Here was evidence that organized religion came first, that the desire to build sacred spaces might have driven the development of agriculture rather than the other way around. Schmidt called it the cathedral on the hill and spent the rest of his career trying to understand it. The carvings on the pillars are extraordinary. Unlike the crude scratches you might expect from prehistoric artists, these are detailed, skillful representations of animals and abstract symbols. Some pillars feature hands and arms carved in relief, suggesting the T-shapes might represent stylized human figures. Others show what appear to be loincloths or belts, adding to the anthropomorphic impression. The animals depicted include species that were wild and dangerous, predators and venomous creatures that would have posed real threats to human survival. This wasn't decorative art. This was something else. Religious symbolism, mythological storytelling, or a visual language we no longer understand. And here's what really bakes your noodle. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Sometime around 8000 BC, after being in use for roughly 2,000 years, the entire complex was intentionally covered with soil and debris. Not abandoned and left to crumble, actively buried, as if someone wanted to preserve it or hide it from future generations. The burial actually protected the site remarkably well. which is why the carvings remain so crisp after 12 millennia. But it raises obvious questions. Why would you spend centuries building an elaborate temple complex and then bury it on purpose? What changed? What were they trying to accomplish? The people who buried Göbekli Tepe left no explanation, and we're left to speculate about motivations that made sense 12,000 years ago, but are utterly opaque today. Excavations have revealed that what we've uncovered so far is probably just 5% of the total site. Ground-penetrating radar surveys suggest there are at least 16 more stone circles still buried beneath the hilltop, plus additional structures that might extend the complex even further. We've been digging for 30 years and barely scratched the surface. Whatever Göbekli Tepe was, it was enormous. A religious center that drew worshippers from across the region, a gathering place for people who supposedly had no capacity for gathering, a monument to beliefs we cannot reconstruct from a society we didn't know existed. From the hills of Turkey, let's descend beneath the waves to Japan, where another anomalous structure has been sparking debate since its discovery in 1987. The Yonaguni Monument lies off the coast of Yonaguni Island, the westernmost point of Japan, submerged in about 25 meters of water. It consists of massive stone terraces, stairways, and what appear to be carved walls, a structure that looks, to many observers, distinctly artificial. The problem? If it was built by humans, it would have to have been constructed during the last ice age, when sea levels were low enough for this area to be dry land. That means more than 10,000 years ago, during the same period when Göbekli Tepe was being built on the other side of the world. The Yonaguni Monument was discovered by a local diver named Kihachiro Aratake, who stumbled upon the structure while searching for new diving spots for tourists. What he found looked like nothing else in the region. Flat platforms with sharp right angles, apparent staircases with regular step heights, triangular depressions that resembled carved pools, and what some researchers describe as a carved face on one of the rock surfaces. The structure spans about 500 feet in length and rises about 80 feet from the seafloor. It's massive, regular, and deeply weird. The debate over Yonaguni has been fierce and, frankly, unresolved. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus has studied the monument extensively and argues it shows clear signs of human modification, tool marks, carved steps, and geometric precision that natural processes cannot explain. He believes it was a ceremonial center, or perhaps a small city, built when the area was above water and later submerged by rising seas at the end of the Ice Age. Other geologists disagree vehemently, arguing that the formations are entirely natural, the result of tectonic activity and the natural fracturing patterns of the local sandstone, which tends to break in regular geometric shapes. According to this view, what looks artificial is simply a coincidence of geology. The honest answer is that we don't know. Yonaguni exhibits features that could be natural or could be artificial, and distinguishing between the two is genuinely difficult. Natural stone can fracture in surprisingly regular patterns, but natural stone doesn't usually produce the specific combination of features found at Yonaguni: the staircases, the platforms, the apparent pathways. The site remains in a frustrating limbo between probably natural and possibly artificial, with passionate advocates on both sides and no definitive evidence to settle the question. What's clear is that if Yonaguni is artificial, it rewrites our understanding of prehistoric Japan and suggests a level of maritime civilization that predates recorded history by thousands of years. And if you think Yonaguni is controversial, wait until you hear about Cuba. In 2001, a Canadian company called Advanced Digital Communications was conducting sonar surveys off the western coast of Cuba, mapping the seafloor for a commercial project. At a depth of about 600 to 700 meters, that's nearly half a mile down, they detected something bizarre: geometric structures that appeared to show streets, buildings, and pyramid-shaped formations arranged in an organized pattern. The sonar images looked, unmistakably, like an underwater city. Paulina Zalitsky, the oceanographer leading the survey, described the formations as appearing like an urban development, with structures that resembled pyramids and buildings. The site covered an area of roughly 2 square kilometers and featured what looked like carved stone blocks and organized architecture. The depth was significant. 600 meters below current sea level means that if these structures were built on dry land, they would have to date from a period when sea levels were dramatically lower than today, possibly during the last ice age or even earlier. Some calculations suggested the area might not have been above water for 50,000 years or more. Initial excitement was enormous. An ancient city off Cuba, built by an unknown civilization, predating everything in the archaeological record. This would be the discovery of the century, rewriting human history completely. National Geographic expressed interest in funding further exploration. Media coverage exploded, and then nothing. Further investigations were promised, but never materialized. The Cuban government, which controls access to the site, has not permitted additional research. The original sonar data has never been independently verified. The Cuban underwater city remains one of the most tantalizing and frustrating mysteries in modern archaeology, a potential game-changer that might also be a sonar glitch, a natural geological formation, or an elaborate misinterpretation. Critics point out several problems with the Cuban discovery. The depth is extreme, far deeper than any known human settlement from any period. The date implied by that depth would push human civilization back to a point when our ancestors were barely out of Africa, let alone building cities. And sonar data, while useful, can be misleading. Acoustic shadows and geological formations can create patterns that look artificial on screen, but turn out to be natural when examined directly. Without physical samples, underwater photography, or direct exploration, the Cuban site remains unverified. A mystery that could revolutionize history, or could be nothing at all. But here's what ties Göbekli Tepe, Yonaguni, and Cuba together. They all suggest that human civilization might be much older than we thought. The traditional model, agriculture leads to settlement, leads to complexity, looks increasingly like a just-so story. A narrative we constructed because it made sense, not because the evidence demanded it. Göbekli Tepe proves that complex religious architecture preceded agriculture. Yonaguni and Cuba, if artificial, would prove that sophisticated societies existed during or before the Ice Age, when humans were supposedly primitive wanderers. Each discovery on its own might be explained away or reinterpreted. Together, they form a pattern that's harder to dismiss. The implications are profound. If civilization is older than we think, what else have we missed? How many ancient sites lie beneath the waves, submerged when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age? Coastal regions would have been prime real estate for early humans. Access to seafood, moderate climates, easy transportation by boat. But the coastlines of 12,000 years ago are now underwater, inaccessible to conventional archaeology. We've been looking for the origins of civilization on land that used to be inland, missing the coastal settlements that might have been the real cradles of human development. It's like searching for your keys under the streetlight, because that's where the light is, not because that's where you dropped them. The standard archaeological response to these anomalies is caution, and that caution is appropriate. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence for Ice Age civilizations remains fragmentary and contested. But caution can also become a barrier to discovery if it prevents researchers from taking seriously data that contradicts established models. Göbekli Tepe was dismissed as a medieval cemetery for 30 years because it didn't fit what archaeologists expected to find. How many other sites have been overlooked, misidentified, or ignored because they didn't match our preconceptions? We stand at a strange moment in the study of human prehistory. The old certainties are crumbling. The neat timeline of progress, from caves to farms to cities, looks increasingly like a simplification at best, a fantasy at worst. Something was happening 12,000 years ago, something more sophisticated than our models predicted. Whether that something connects to Yonaguni, to Cuba, to other underwater anomalies waiting to be discovered, remains to be seen. But the question is no longer whether our understanding of prehistoric humanity is incomplete. The question is how incomplete it is, and what we've been missing while we weren't looking. From the drowned ruins of possible civilizations, let's surface to examine something equally baffling, but considerably more portable. Mysterious geometric objects that have been turning up across the globe, crafted with mathematical precision that shouldn't exist, for purposes that nobody can identify. Because apparently, ancient peoples weren't content just building monuments we can't explain. They also left us perfectly shaped objects that serve no discernible function, like the universe's most elaborate practical joke spread across continents and centuries. First stop, Costa Rica, land of beautiful beaches, excellent coffee, and approximately 300 giant stone balls that have been confusing everyone since the 1930s. The stone spheres of Costa Rica are exactly what they sound like. Spheres made of stone, ranging in size from a few centimeters in diameter to over 2 meters across, weighing up to 16 tons. They were first discovered by workers clearing jungle for banana plantations in the Dikis Delta region. And the initial reaction was probably something like, "Huh, that's weird," followed by, "Let's move it out of the way so we can plant bananas." Many spheres were subsequently destroyed, moved, or sold to collectors before anyone realized they might be archaeologically significant. By the time researchers started taking them seriously, the original context of most spheres had been lost. They'd been relocated to gardens, plazas, and private collections across Costa Rica and beyond. What we know about the spheres is limited but tantalizing. They were made by the Dikis culture, which flourished in southern Costa Rica from around 700 AD to the Spanish conquest in the 16th century. The spheres are carved from granodiorite, a hard ignite rock similar to granite, and they're remarkably close to perfectly spherical. Measurements show deviations of only a few centimeters even on the largest examples. Creating a 2-meter sphere from granodiorite with hand tools is not a casual afternoon project. It requires sophisticated understanding of geometry, careful measurement, and endless hours of grinding and polishing. These weren't rough approximations. They were precision instruments of stone. But here's the mystery. We have no idea what they were for. The Dikis people left no written records, and by the time the Spanish arrived, the sphere-making tradition had apparently ended. Local indigenous peoples had no memory of the sphere's original purpose. Archaeological excavations have found spheres in various contexts, some arranged in lines or geometric patterns, others placed at the entrances to buildings, still others apparently random. Some spheres were found in burial sites, suggesting possible religious significance. Others were positioned in what might have been public plazas or ceremonial spaces. None of this tells us why someone would spend months carving a 16-ton ball of stone and then do what with it exactly? Theories abound, naturally. Some researchers propose the spheres were status symbols. The bigger your stone ball, the more important you were. This makes a certain kind of sense. Throughout history, humans have demonstrated their power by commissioning absurdly labor-intensive objects with no practical function. Others suggest astronomical alignments, arguing that the sphere's positions corresponded to celestial events or mapped constellations on the ground. The problem with this theory is that most spheres have been moved from their original locations, making it impossible to verify any astronomical purpose. Still others propose territorial markers, religious offerings, or symbols of political authority. All of these explanations are plausible. None of them are proven. The spheres sit in museums and parks across Costa Rica, perfectly round and perfectly silent, offering no explanation for their existence. The craftsmanship is particularly puzzling. Granodiorite is extremely hard, roughly a 6 on the Mohs scale, meaning it can only be worked with tools of equal or greater hardness. The Dikis people didn't have metal tools harder than copper, which is far too soft to carve granodiorite effectively. This means they must have used other stones as hammers and grinders, slowly pecking and polishing their way to spherical perfection over months or years of dedicated effort. The patience required is almost incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. Imagine spending 6 months grinding a rock into a ball for reasons that no one can explain and no one will remember. That's devotion to something. We just don't know what. Adding to the mystery is the absence of identifiable quarries. The granodiorite had to come from somewhere, but no one has definitively located the source. The nearest known outcrops of suitable stone are in the Talamanca mountain range, some 50 kilometers from the Dikis Delta, where most spheres were found. Moving a 16-ton stone ball 50 kilometers through jungle terrain without wheeled vehicles or draft animals is, shall we say, non-trivial. Either the Dikis had transportation methods we haven't discovered, or there were quarries closer to the delta that have since been overgrown, or the spheres were carved in the mountains and rolled downhill, which is an entertaining mental image, but probably not accurate. The stone spheres of Costa Rica were designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2014, which means they're now officially considered important, even though we still don't know why they exist. They've also become a national symbol of Costa Rica, appearing on currency and in tourism campaigns. The country has embraced its mysterious stone balls with understandable enthusiasm. When you've got 300 inexplicable perfect spheres lying around, you might as well make them a selling point. Now let's travel across the Atlantic to the remains of the Roman Empire, where an equally mysterious geometric object has been puzzling scholars for centuries. Meet the Roman dodecahedron, a hollow bronze object with 12 pentagonal faces, each face featuring a circular hole of varying diameter, with small knobs at each of the 20 vertices. Over 100 of these objects have been found across what was once the northern provinces of the Roman Empire: modern-day France, Germany, Britain, Belgium, the Netherlands, Austria, and Switzerland. And despite the Romans' legendary record-keeping and their tendency to document absolutely everything, not a single ancient text mentions what these objects were or what they were used for. Let that sink in. The Romans wrote about military tactics, agricultural techniques, cooking recipes, medical treatments, religious rituals, legal procedures, and gossip about their neighbors' love lives. They carved inscriptions on everything from temples to tombstones. They left behind a massive corpus of literature, correspondence, and administrative records. And yet, despite the fact that dodecahedra were apparently common enough to be found across thousands of miles of territory, not one Roman author ever thought to mention, "Oh, and we have these weird bronze things with holes in them." The silence is deafening. The objects themselves are consistent in their basic design, but vary in size, from about 4 centimeters to 11 centimeters in diameter. The holes in each face are different sizes, ranging from roughly 1 centimeter to 4 centimeters, and the sizes seem to follow a pattern, though what that pattern represents is anyone's guess. The knobs at each corner serve no obvious structural purpose, but are present on virtually every example. Some dodecahedra show signs of heavy use and wear. Others appear almost pristine. They were valuable enough that people kept them, lost them, and occasionally buried them with their dead, but apparently not valuable enough to write about. The theories about Roman dodecahedra could fill a book, and indeed have filled several. Here's a sampling of the more popular ideas. Survey instruments. Some researchers propose that the dodecahedra were used for surveying or astronomical observation, with the different sized holes corresponding to specific angles or alignments. You could theoretically sight through the holes to measure distances or track celestial objects. The problem with this theory is that the Romans already had perfectly good surveying instruments, well-documented ones, and there's no evidence the dodecahedra were used this way. Candle holders. The knobs could serve as stands, and the hollow center could hold a candle or oil lamp. This is plausible, but doesn't explain why you'd need 12 pentagonal faces with different sized holes just to hold a candle. A simple cup would work much better. Rangefinders for military purposes. One theory suggests soldiers used them to calculate distances to enemy positions by looking through the appropriately sized hole. Again, plausible, but completely unsupported by any military texts or archaeological context. Religious or ritualistic objects. Many dodecahedra have been found in religious sites or graves, suggesting possible sacred significance. But "it was religious" is the archaeological equivalent of "I don't know." Technically possible, but explanatorily empty. Children's toys. Some researchers have suggested they were simply playthings, ancient equivalents of building blocks or puzzles. The craftsmanship seems excessive for toys, but stranger things have happened. Knitting tools. This theory, proposed more recently, suggests the dodecahedra were used for making finger-sized tubes of knitted fabric. Glove fingers, perhaps. Experiments have shown this actually works, and it would explain the different hole sizes. Whether Roman soldiers were secretly knitting in their spare time remains an open question. The honest answer is that we don't know, and we may never know. The dodecahedra exist. They were made deliberately, with care and precision. They served some purpose important enough that they were kept, transported, and sometimes buried with their owners. And then, the Romans collectively decided not to write a single word about what that purpose was, leaving us to speculate for the next 2,000 years. Thanks, Rome. Really helpful. What links the Costa Rican spheres and the Roman dodecahedra is the combination of mathematical precision and complete functional obscurity. Both objects demonstrate sophisticated understanding of geometry. Perfect spheres, regular dodecahedra, that required significant skill to create. Both were produced in substantial quantities, suggesting they served some widespread cultural purpose. And both remain utterly mysterious, despite decades of study by qualified researchers. There's something almost humbling about these objects. We live in an age of unprecedented information access, where the purpose of virtually any modern artifact can be determined with a quick internet search. We document everything, explain everything, label everything. The idea that an entire culture could create hundreds of carefully crafted objects without leaving any explanation of what they were for seems almost alien to us. But that's precisely what happened, repeatedly, across different cultures and different continents. The ancient world was full of meaning that we've lost access to, significance that evaporated when the last person who understood it died. Perhaps the most disturbing possibility is that the explanations, if we ever found them, would be disappointingly mundane. The stone spheres might just be territorial markers, ancient equivalents of "keep off my lawn" signs, that accumulated mystique only because we forgot what they meant. The dodecahedra might be nothing more than games or tools for crafts that have since gone out of fashion. The mystery might be entirely of our own making, a product of lost context rather than hidden profundity. But even that would be meaningful in its way. It would remind us how fragile meaning is, how easily it can slip away when the people who created it are gone. For now, the spheres and the dodecahedra remain enigmas. They sit in museums and private collections, perfectly geometric and perfectly inscrutable. Researchers continue to propose new theories, and perhaps someone will crack the code, find the missing text, discover the right archaeological context, or simply have the flash of insight that makes everything click into place. Until then, these objects serve as reminders that the past is a foreign country, and sometimes, even its most common artifacts speak languages we've forgotten how to understand. From civilizations that might have existed before history began, let's turn to knowledge that definitely existed and was deliberately destroyed. Because if the previous chapters made you uncomfortable about how much we don't know, this one is going to make you genuinely angry. We're talking about the greatest intellectual catastrophe in human history. The systematic destruction of ancient libraries, archives, and repositories of knowledge that could have changed everything. Welcome to the bonfire of human memory, where centuries of accumulated wisdom went up in smoke because somebody decided the world didn't need it anymore. The Library of Alexandria. Even the name carries a kind of mystical weight, a sense of loss so profound that it echoes through the centuries. Founded in the 3rd century BC under the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt, the library was the ancient world's most ambitious attempt to collect all human knowledge in one place. Every ship that entered Alexandria's harbor was searched, and any scrolls found on board were confiscated, copied, and added to the collection. Sometimes the originals were kept and the copies returned to their owners. The Ptolemies weren't just building a library, they were conducting intellectual piracy on a civilizational scale, and they were completely unapologetic about it. At its height, the Library of Alexandria housed somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. Nobody knows the exact number because, well, it burned down. But let's think about what that means. This was a collection assembled over 3 centuries, drawing on sources from Greece, Egypt, Persia, India, and everywhere else the ancient world could reach. It contained the complete works of playwrights, philosophers, and historians whose names we barely remember today. Medical treatises describing treatments we've lost, astronomical observations made over generations, mathematical proofs that took centuries to rediscover, engineering manuals for machines we can only guess at. All of it gathered in one place, organized by the finest scholars of the age, available to anyone who could read. And then it was gone. The destruction of the library wasn't a single dramatic event, despite what Hollywood would have you believe. It died in stages, through a combination of accidents, neglect, and deliberate violence spread over several centuries. Julius Caesar's troops accidentally set fire to part of the collection during the Alexandrian War in 48 BC. Christian mobs attacked the associated Serapeum Temple in 391 AD. Muslim conquerors supposedly finished the job in 642 AD, though this last account is disputed by many historians. The truth is probably messier. The library declined gradually as funding dried up, scholars dispersed, and the political will to maintain such an institution evaporated. Death by 1,000 cuts, rather than a single dramatic conflagration. But the result was the same. Centuries of human achievement vanished. We have fragments, tantalizing references in later texts to works that no longer exist. We know that Euclid's Elements survived, arguably the most influential mathematics textbook ever written. But Euclid wrote other works, including one on conic sections, that are lost. Aristarchus of Samos proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system 18 centuries before Copernicus. We know this only from brief mentions in other texts, because his original work didn't survive. The playwright Sophocles wrote over 120 plays, 7 survive. Aeschylus wrote between 70 and 90 plays, 7 survive. For every ancient author whose work we have, there are dozens whose names we know, but whose writings are gone forever, and hundreds more whose names we've forgotten entirely. The loss is incalculable. And I mean that literally. We cannot calculate what was lost because we don't know what was there. It's like trying to measure a hole when you don't know how big the thing that filled it used to be. We can only glimpse the absence through occasional references, through medieval scholars quoting books that no longer exist, through discoveries of fragments that hint at larger works. Every now and then, a previously lost text resurfaces, found in a monastery library, hidden in a palimpsest, preserved in an Arabic translation. Each recovery is celebrated as a miracle. But for every text recovered, thousands remain lost, their contents known only to the flames that consumed them. And Alexandria wasn't alone. The ancient world had other great libraries: Pergamum, Antioch, Constantinople. And all of them eventually fell to war, fire, or religious iconoclasm. The pattern is depressingly consistent. Humans spend centuries accumulating knowledge, writing it down, preserving it carefully. Then some catastrophe, military, political, religious, sweeps through, and the accumulated wisdom of generations disappears in a single night. We like to think of knowledge as permanent, as something that once discovered can never be undiscovered. But that's not true. Knowledge requires preservation. It requires institutions willing to maintain it, societies willing to fund those institutions, and political stability to protect both. Remove any of those elements, and knowledge dies as surely as any living thing. Now let's talk about something even stranger. A monument so magnificent that ancient writers ranked it above the pyramids, described in vivid detail by multiple sources, visited by tourists for centuries, and yet we cannot find it. The Egyptian labyrinth is one of history's most baffling disappearing acts, and its absence raises questions that historians have been unable to answer. The Greek historian Herodotus visited the labyrinth around 450 BC and was so impressed that he devoted considerable space to describing it. According to his account, the complex contained 3,000 rooms, 1,500 above ground and 1,500 below, arranged around 12 covered courtyards. The structure was built of white limestone, with walls covered in carved figures and paintings. Herodotus claimed it surpassed even the pyramids in grandeur, and he was not a man given to casual exaggeration. Other ancient writers echoed his amazement. Strabo described it as a great palace composed of many palaces. Pliny the Elder mentioned it in his Natural History. Diodorus Siculus wrote about its incredible craftsmanship. These weren't obscure sources or unreliable narrators. They were the most respected historians and geographers of the ancient world, and they all agreed. The labyrinth was real, it was enormous, and it was magnificent. So where is it? The obvious answer is that it was destroyed, dismantled for building materials like so many ancient monuments. Egypt has been continuously inhabited for thousands of years, and stone is valuable. The pyramids themselves would probably have been torn apart if they weren't so enormous that the effort wasn't worth the stone. A structure of the labyrinth's size, with all that worked limestone, would have been an irresistible quarry for later builders. This is plausible. It's probably correct. But it's also frustrating, because we should at least be able to find the foundations. Archaeological surveys have identified a probable site near the Hawara Pyramid in the Fayum region, where massive stone foundations suggest a large building once stood. Some researchers believe this is the labyrinth, reduced to its base by centuries of stone robbing. The dimensions roughly match what the ancient sources describe, but the excavations have been limited, and the evidence is far from conclusive. Other scholars have proposed alternative locations, or suggested that Herodotus exaggerated what he saw, or that the labyrinth was actually the mortuary temple complex of Amenemhat III, impressive in its time, but not quite the 3,000-room wonder described in the texts. The uncertainty is maddening. We have detailed descriptions from multiple ancient witnesses. We have a probable location. We have fragmentary archaeological evidence, but we don't have the labyrinth itself, and we may never find it. If it was truly as massive as Herodotus claimed, the foundations alone should be substantial. If it was dismantled for building materials, there should be records, traces, blocks with distinctive markings showing up in later constructions. Instead, we have almost nothing. Just the words of ancient visitors describing a wonder they saw with their own eyes, and an empty space where that wonder used to be. The labyrinth represents something slightly different from the Library of Alexandria. The library was a repository of knowledge, ideas, information, accumulated wisdom. The labyrinth was a physical structure, but it too embodied knowledge. Architectural techniques, artistic traditions, organizational principles that allowed such a complex building to be designed and constructed. Both are gone. Both represent capacities that existed in the ancient world and have been lost. And both remind us that destruction is the default state of human achievement. Preservation is the exception, the fragile result of careful effort sustained across generations. When that effort fails, when war comes, when funding stops, when priorities change, what took centuries to build can vanish in an instant. Consider what else has been lost that we don't even know about. The Library of Alexandria is famous precisely because we know it existed and know it was destroyed. But how many other libraries, archives, and repositories have been lost without even that much record? How many cultures developed sophisticated knowledge systems that were never written down, or were written in languages that died with their speakers? The Inca had no writing system, yet they ran an empire spanning thousands of miles using quipu, knotted strings that encoded information in ways we still don't fully understand. When the Spanish conquered Peru, they systematically destroyed quipu and suppressed the knowledge required to read them. An entire civilization's record-keeping system obliterated in a generation. And the Inca are relatively recent, relatively well documented. What about the countless societies that rose and fell before writing was invented, whose achievements were preserved only in oral tradition until the last speaker died and the knowledge died with them? Every culture that has achieved literacy has eventually faced the question of what to preserve and what to let go. Scrolls decay, books rot, storage space is finite. Someone has to decide which texts are worth copying, worth maintaining, worth passing to the next generation. For every work that survives, dozens were deemed less important and allowed to perish. The texts we have from the ancient world represent not just what was written, but what was valued enough to preserve through centuries of copying and recopying. The vast majority of ancient writing, the mundane records, the unpopular opinions, the works by authors without powerful patrons, simply didn't make the cut. They were left to rot in warehouses, used as fuel for fires, scraped clean so the parchment could be reused for something deemed more important. The process continues today, of course. We live in an age of unprecedented information production, but also unprecedented information loss. Digital formats become obsolete. Websites disappear. Server failures destroy data that was never backed up. The average web page has a lifespan of about 100 days before it vanishes or changes beyond recognition. We like to think we're preserving everything, that the internet remembers all. But the internet forgets constantly, and future historians studying our era may face gaps as profound as any we encounter in the ancient record. The burned memory of humanity isn't just a historical phenomenon. It's an ongoing process, happening all around us, right now. The Library of Alexandria haunts us because it represents potential. We don't mourn the specific books that burned. We don't know what they contained. We mourn what they might have contained, the discoveries that might have been made earlier, the mistakes that might have been avoided, the questions that might have been answered if only that knowledge had survived. It's the absence of possibility that hurts. The roads not taken because the maps were destroyed. The Egyptian labyrinth haunts us for similar reasons. We mourn not just a building, but a demonstration of human capability. Proof that ancient engineers could conceive and execute something so magnificent that visitors ranked it above the pyramids. That proof is gone now, leaving only words that describe a wonder no one alive has seen. What else has been burned, buried, dismantled, or simply forgotten? What other libraries held secrets we can barely imagine? What other monuments demonstrated capabilities we no longer possess? The honest answer is, we don't know, and probably never will. History is what survives the flames. Everything else is silence. And the silence, if you listen carefully, is deafening. From the burned memory of humanity, let's descend into something darker. The realm of ancient curses, mysterious deaths, and faces frozen in eternal agony. Because the ancient world wasn't just building monuments and writing scrolls. They were also, apparently, laying supernatural traps for anyone foolish enough to disturb their dead. Welcome to the spookier side of archaeology, where opening the wrong door might cost you more than your grant funding. November 26, 1922. The Valley of the Kings, Egypt. After years of searching and spending someone else's money, British archaeologist Howard Carter finally breaks through the sealed doorway of a tomb that had remained hidden for over 3,000 years. His financial backer, Lord Carnarvon, stands beside him, trembling with anticipation. Carter makes a small hole in the door, holds up a candle to peer inside, and falls silent. "Can you see anything?" Carnarvon asks. "Yes," Carter replies. "Wonderful things." They had found the tomb of Tutankhamun, the boy pharaoh who died at 18 and was buried with enough gold to make a dragon jealous. It was the most intact royal tomb ever discovered in Egypt, a time capsule of unimaginable wealth and historical significance. It was also, according to the newspapers of the day, cursed. Lord Carnarvon died less than 5 months after the tomb was opened. The cause was blood poisoning from an infected mosquito bite, complicated by pneumonia, thoroughly mundane, medically speaking. But the timing was suspicious enough to launch 1,000 headlines. "Death comes on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king," one paper dramatically proclaimed, claiming this inscription had been found above the tomb entrance. It hadn't. No such inscription existed. But facts rarely stand in the way of a good curse story. As more members of the expedition died over the following years, the legend grew. The Curse of the Pharaohs became one of the most enduring supernatural narratives of the 20th century, a story that blended ancient Egyptian mysticism with modern anxieties about science overstepping its bounds. Let's examine the evidence with the cold eye of someone who doesn't own a newspaper. Of the 58 people present at the tomb's opening or closely involved in the excavation, only 8 died within the following 12 years. Howard Carter himself, the man who actually broke the seal, who was first to enter, who spent years cataloging the tomb's contents, lived until 1939, dying at age 64 of lymphoma. If there was a curse, it was remarkably selective, sparing the primary tomb violator while striking down his patron over a mosquito bite. The other deaths attributed to the curse were similarly underwhelming when examined closely. People who died of known diseases at ages that weren't particularly unusual, their deaths retroactively connected to Tutankhamun by journalists who needed dramatic copy. But here's where it gets interesting. The ancient Egyptians absolutely did believe in curses, and they absolutely did inscribe warnings on their tombs. Texts threatening divine punishment for tomb robbers have been found throughout Egypt. Promises that violators would be devoured by crocodiles, struck down by the gods, denied afterlife, or subjected to various other unpleasant fates. These weren't empty words to the people who wrote them. They represented genuine magical protection, part of a comprehensive system of beliefs about death, the afterlife, and the power of written language to affect reality. The question isn't whether the Egyptians believed their curses worked. They clearly did. The question is whether those curses actually had any power beyond psychology. Modern researchers have proposed various scientific explanations for the curse. Some tombs contain toxic mold spores or bacteria that could cause respiratory illness in people breathing unfiltered air in enclosed spaces. Lord Carnarvon already had compromised health from a car accident years earlier. Exposure to such pathogens might have weakened him further. Others have suggested that ancient Egyptians deliberately introduced toxic substances, arsenic-based paints, poisonous plants, as a form of biological warfare against future grave robbers. These theories are plausible but largely unproven. The honest answer is that the Curse of the Pharaohs is almost certainly a media invention, a narrative constructed from coincidental deaths and fed by public fascination with all things Egyptian. But even if the curse wasn't literally real, its psychological power was undeniable. The idea that ancient civilizations could reach across millennia to punish those who violated their dead, that's a compelling story, one that speaks to deep anxieties about death, desecration, and the hubris of disturbing things meant to remain hidden. The Egyptians understood this. Their curses were, at minimum, psychological deterrents, warnings designed to make potential tomb robbers think twice before breaking in. Whether they believed the curses had supernatural force or simply recognized their value as intimidation, the effect was the same. Fear, planted like a seed, growing in the minds of anyone who contemplated violation. Now let's talk about something genuinely unsettling, the screaming mummy. Because while the curse might be fiction, this is terrifyingly real. In 1886, Gaston Maspero, the head of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, was unwrapping a mummy found in a cache of royal remains at Deir el-Bahri. Most mummies have serene, composed expressions. Their faces were carefully arranged before wrapping, positioned for eternity. This one was different. Its mouth was stretched wide open in an expression of absolute agony, as if the person had died screaming and been preserved in that moment forever. The mummy was wrapped in sheepskin, considered ritually impure by Egyptian standards, and placed in an unmarked coffin with no name, no titles, no prayers for the afterlife. Whoever this person was, they had been deliberately denied the proper burial rites that Egyptians believed were essential for the soul's journey to the next world. The mummy became known as Unknown Man E, and for over a century, his identity and the circumstances of his death remained mysterious. Recent DNA analysis has provided some answers. Unknown Man E was almost certainly Prince Pentawar, a son of Pharaoh Ramesses III, who was involved in a conspiracy to assassinate his father around 1155 BC. The conspiracy, known as the Harem Conspiracy, was led by one of Ramses' minor wives who wanted her son on the throne instead of the designated heir. The plot succeeded in killing the pharaoh, but failed in its larger goal. The conspirators were caught, tried, and punished. Ancient court records describe the punishments meted out to the conspirators. Some were executed. Others were forced to commit suicide, a fate considered more shameful than execution because it denied them proper burial rites. Pentawar, according to these records, was given the opportunity to take his own life. If Unknown Man E is indeed Pentawar, the evidence suggests he was strangled or hanged himself, and his body was deliberately mummified without proper rituals as additional punishment. The screaming expression might be the result of his jaw dropping open after death as decomposition set in before the hasty, improper mummification. Or it might be exactly what it looks like: a man who died in agony, denied peace even in death. The Egyptians believed that proper burial was essential for the soul's survival in the afterlife. The body had to be preserved correctly. The name had to be written. Prayers and spells had to be included to guide the spirit through the underworld. Without these elements, the soul would wander eternally, never reaching the paradise of the field of reeds, suffering forever in a state of non-being. To deny someone proper burial wasn't just disrespectful, it was cosmic punishment, condemning them to an eternity of torment. Unknown Man E's burial, with its sheepskin wrapping, unmarked coffin, and screaming face, appears designed to inflict exactly this fate. Someone wanted him to suffer forever. The cache where Unknown Man E was found contained dozens of royal mummies, moved there by priests during a period of tomb robberies in the 20th dynasty. These weren't random dead. These were pharaohs, queens, and princes, the most important people in Egyptian history. That Pentawar was buried among them, despite his crime and punishment, suggests someone with authority wanted to preserve even this disgraced prince, perhaps out of family loyalty, or perhaps to ensure his suffering continued for eternity, where the gods could witness it. The Egyptians didn't do anything by accident when it came to death. Every detail of Unknown Man E's burial was intentional, designed to communicate something across the centuries. We just can't be entirely sure what. Other screaming mummies have been found, though none as famous as Unknown Man E. Some appear to be individuals who died suddenly, before their bodies could be arranged for burial. Others may have experienced post-mortem jaw relaxation that created the open-mouthed expression. But each one raises the same unsettling questions. What happened to this person? Why were they preserved this way? And what message were their buriers trying to send? The ancient world treated death with a seriousness we can barely comprehend today. The line between life and death, this world and the next, was permeable and dangerous. The dead could help the living, or haunt them. Proper burial was protection for everyone involved. And improper burial, deliberate, malicious improper burial, was a weapon of last resort, reserved for those whose crimes were so severe that even death wasn't punishment enough. From faces frozen in screams, let's turn to tombs that have vanished entirely, or never existed in the first place. Because the ancient world also contains a special category of mystery, burial sites that we know should exist, that historical sources describe in detail, that logic insists must be somewhere, and yet cannot be found. These are the graves that history swallowed whole, leaving only legends and frustration for anyone who tries to locate them. Start with the big one. Genghis Khan, founder of the largest contiguous land empire in human history, conqueror of everything from China to Eastern Europe, responsible for the deaths of approximately 40 million people, roughly 10% of the world's population at the time. When he died in 1227, his body was transported back to Mongolia for burial. And then it disappeared. According to various legends, the measures taken to conceal Genghis Khan's tomb were extreme, even by the standards of paranoid emperors. Some accounts claim that the funeral escort killed everyone they encountered along the route to prevent anyone from knowing the location. The soldiers who dug the grave were killed by the soldiers who guarded them, who were then killed by another group, ensuring that no witness survived. Horses were driven over the burial site to destroy any visible traces. Some legends say a river was diverted to flow over the tomb, permanently hiding it beneath water. Others claim that trees were planted over the site, allowing the forest to reclaim it within a generation. The Mongols were nomads who left few permanent structures. Their greatest leader would leave no monument at all, only empty steppe and silence. Is any of this true? Probably some of it, possibly none of it. The Mongols had strong cultural prohibitions against disturbing the dead, which might explain both the extreme secrecy surrounding the burial and the complete absence of later attempts to locate it. For 800 years, the tomb of Genghis Khan has remained hidden, despite numerous expeditions, satellite surveys, and ground-penetrating radar searches. The most likely location is somewhere in the Khenti Mountains of northeastern Mongolia, near where Genghis Khan was born, but somewhere in a mountain range covers a lot of territory. Modern Mongolians generally oppose invasive searches for the tomb, considering them disrespectful to their greatest historical figure. The mystery, it seems, is intentional, and those who might help solve it prefer to keep it mysterious. The irony is profound. Genghis Khan conquered half the known world, built an empire that reshaped human history, and left a genetic legacy that some researchers estimate includes 16 million living descendants. His name is synonymous with conquest and power, and yet his physical remains have vanished so completely that we can't even prove they exist. The man who took everything from his enemies left nothing for history to find. Whether this was his intention, a final act of control, ensuring that no one could ever possess or desecrate his body, or simply the result of nomadic burial practices applied to an unusual situation, we may never know. The tomb of Genghis Khan is the ultimate locked room mystery. Except we're not even sure the room exists. From the steppes of Mongolia, let's travel to the hills of central China, where an even stranger mystery awaits. The White Pyramid of Xi'an is either one of the largest pyramids ever built, larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza, or a complete misidentification based on grainy photographs and wishful thinking. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in between, and considerably more complicated than the legend suggests. The story begins in 1945, when a U.S. Army Air Corps pilot named James Gaussman was flying over China on a mission to resupply Chinese forces. According to his later account, he spotted an enormous white pyramid in the mountains southwest of Xi'an, gleaming in the sunlight, far larger than any pyramid he had seen in Egypt. Gaussman took photographs, which were classified and eventually lost. 2 years later, another pilot reported seeing a similar structure in the same region. The White Pyramid entered the realm of legend, a massive ancient structure hidden in China, possibly predating the Egyptian pyramids, potentially built by a lost civilization, definitely being covered up by the Chinese government. Here's what we actually know. The Xi'an region of China contains numerous ancient pyramids, or more accurately, pyramid-shaped mounds, built as tombs for Chinese emperors and nobles over thousands of years. These include the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, which we discussed earlier, as well as dozens of other imperial burial mounds from the Han and other dynasties. Many of these mounds are genuinely enormous, rivaling or exceeding the volume of Egyptian pyramids. They're not hidden. They've been known to archaeologists for decades. They're simply not as famous in the West as their Egyptian counterparts, partly because Chinese authorities have been reluctant to allow extensive excavation, and partly because earthen mounds are less photogenic than limestone monuments. The White Pyramid that Gaussman reported seeing was probably the Maoling Mausoleum, the tomb of Emperor Wu of Han, which is one of the largest ancient structures in China. Under certain lighting conditions, especially when dusted with snow or viewed through haze, these earthen pyramids can appear lighter in color than they typically look. Gaussman, flying at altitude, unfamiliar with Chinese geography, might easily have mistaken the scale and appearance of what he was seeing. The white appearance that gave the pyramid its legendary status was probably a trick of light, weather, and distance. But here's where the mystery persists. The Chinese government has been notably reluctant to allow Western researchers full access to these sites. Many of the pyramid mounds are in restricted military zones. Excavation has been limited, and findings are not always shared with the international archaeological community. This secrecy has fueled speculation that the Chinese are hiding something, perhaps the true age of the pyramids, perhaps evidence of connections to other ancient civilizations, perhaps technologies or artifacts that would embarrass official historical narratives. In reality, the secrecy probably reflects cultural attitudes toward imperial tombs, bureaucratic inertia, and ordinary political considerations, rather than any grand conspiracy. But probably isn't certainly, and the lack of transparency keeps the White Pyramid legend alive. The deeper issue that both Genghis Khan's tomb and the White Pyramid illuminate is the gap between what we expect to find and what we actually know. Genghis Khan was one of the most powerful men who ever lived. Surely his tomb must be spectacular, filled with treasures, monumentally significant. But Mongol culture didn't work that way. Their leaders were buried simply, secretly, returned to the earth without monuments or markers. Our expectations, shaped by Egyptian pharaohs and Chinese emperors, don't apply. The White Pyramid, similarly, reflects Western expectations about what ancient monuments should look like. We expect pyramids to be made of stone, to be precisely geometric, to be obviously artificial. Chinese imperial mounds are earthen, often eroded into organic shapes, covered with vegetation. They don't match our mental image of pyramid, so we assume the real pyramids must be hidden somewhere else. What other tombs remain unfound? Cleopatra and Mark Antony were supposedly buried together in a magnificent tomb in Alexandria, but no trace has ever been discovered. Alexander the Great's original burial site in Alexandria was visited by Julius Caesar, Augustus, and numerous other ancient dignitaries. But the location was lost during the chaos of late antiquity and has never been rediscovered. Attila the Hun, like Genghis Khan, was buried secretly, with legends claiming the workers who dug his grave were killed to preserve its location. These lost tombs represent some of the most famous figures in human history: conquerors, queens, emperors. And yet, their final resting places have vanished completely. Perhaps that's fitting. These were individuals who sought power, who accumulated wealth, who built empires designed to last forever. And yet nothing lasts forever. Their monuments have crumbled. Their treasures have been scattered. Their very bones have been lost to history. The tombs that don't exist are a reminder that even the mightiest eventually return to anonymity, swallowed by time and earth and the relentless indifference of the universe. Genghis Khan conquered the world, and the world conquered him right back, erasing even the location of his grave. In the end, the steppe keeps its secrets, and the dead keep their silence, and all our searching changes nothing.